So we left off with Exodus 32. We did the first 6 verses, and that was the golden calf. That the people went to Aaron, and the way it's phrased could be kind of confrontational. The way they went to Aaron, and Aaron caved. Aaron was not a good leader. He was left in charge, and he caved. And again, things like leadership, things like courage are often misunderstood. Leadership is simply doing the right thing at the right time. You do that and you are leading. Leaders do the right thing. They do the right thing even when no one else wants to do it. And they stick to their guns even when everyone is against them. And good leaders don't make excuses. And we're going to see Aaron and the excuses that he made. And being a good leader requires courage, because you're going to look at adversity and go ahead and do the right thing. You're going to lead people sometimes where they don't want to go. You're going to have to use that horrible, awful word, no. And Aaron didn't do that. And we see the downward spiral into sin. That it ends up in pagan revelry, I think is what the King James Version calls it. But the connection here, before we get into the stuff for today, the connection here with Baal, it's a golden calf. They're heading toward the land of Canaan, and it's a golden calf that they make that has ties back to Egypt with Apis. It has ties moving forward into the promised land in Canaan with Baal. So a lot of stuff at play here. It's never as simple as it seems. There's always background and context that we need to understand. So Moses, Joshua, they're still up on the mountain. And verse 7, and the Lord said to Moses, go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. That's a pretty intense section of Scripture. It is the most fearful thing imaginable. It's God talking about enacting the most fearful thing imaginable, and that is his swift and terrible judgment. And his judgment is all of those things. It's all of those things. And he is furious. He is furious. And in key sections of Scripture, it's oftentimes helpful to just focus on the pronouns. Focus on the pronouns. The Lord said to Moses, go down. And that's an imperative. It's like he starts off with it. Go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and worshiped it and sacrificed to it. It's that last part. It's like he's spitting it out. He's just beside himself with anger and wrath. But what does he say? He is saying with these pronouns that he has disavowed them. You, the people Your people, they're not my people anymore. But they're still your people because you're part of them. Your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt. He's disclaiming them. He is disinheriting them. And that is a fearful and terrible thing. And he had every right. He had every right. They said, he gave them the 10 words, the 10 commandments, and the other parts of the law there that we went through. And what was it they said? And I've got the reference and a note further down. This we will gladly do. We will obey. We will adhere to your covenant. And the covenant was, you do these things, you hold to these things, because they couldn't do them perfectly, right? But the one thing they couldn't do was take their covenant loyalty, because that's what faith was, right? Faith was covenant loyalty. They were loyal to the covenant, and they would mess up and they would sin and they weren't going to be perfect, but there was the system there of what they do to make up for that, to atone for that through sacrifices, all pointing ahead to Christ. But if they turned away from him altogether, then they broke the covenant. They broke it. All they had to do was be faithful. All they had to do was hold fast to the covenant. And the first chance they got, the first little bit of adversity, and we talked about, it was 40 days. And Moses had always been there. He'd always been with them, and now he was gone. And they kind of had a fit. Like when you leave your dog at home and it freaks out, right? George Carlin had a hilarious. George Carlin was very funny in many ways, especially when he was on TV and he couldn't be dirty. George Carlin was very funny, but he talked about pets. Your dog, when you leave, your dog thinks you're never coming back. Once you go out the door, the dog thinks you're gone forever. So you can turn around, come back in the door because you forgot your keys, and the dog's, oh, I thought you'd never come back, and jumping all over you like you'd been gone all day, right? Well, the children of Israel, the children of Israel had God took Moses up onto the mountain for 40 days. They had a complete fit, a conniption, and they wanted gods that they could see. And part of that too, I touched on this last week. Maybe I didn't. I know I thought about it. We want gods that we can own. We want a God who does what we want. We want genie in the bottle. Rub the lamp, he pops out, he does what we want him to do. And that's not who he is. That isn't the faith relationship that he establishes with us. It is not a proper relationship where we are the created and he is the creator, right? It turns everything upside down. And we take the God to whom we answer, but no, I want a God who answers to me. I don't want this. I don't want that. I want this. I want that. I want to be this. Gimme, gimme, gimme. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Unbelief, rebellion, and unbelief lives in your heart too, lives in mine. Unbelief always does the same thing. It takes things and turns them upside down. It takes things and turns them upside down. And just like the serpent in the garden, did God really say? He took the good things God said and weaponized them, turned them into something bad. God's keeping good stuff from you. You could live forever. You could know everything. You could be just like him, but he won't let you. Why would he do that? Is he really a good God? Well, here it is. Take it into your own hands. Do it for yourself. Be God unto yourselves. Be like God. The first sin. Be like God, right? That's what they wanted. They wanted God, a God that they could control. And in so doing, they broke the covenant. And so God disavows them. He says that it's your people, your people. He wanted nothing more to do with them. They corrupted themselves. And it's the verb that means pollute, spoil, make rotten, perverted, all of that stuff. He's really, really upside. Everything's been turned upside down, and he's very, very upset. They turned aside quickly, and we're just going to go through this a little bit. Let's look at Exodus 20, verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. Not besides me, not before me, not after me. No other gods, I'm it. You shall not make for yourselves a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is on earth beneath, like a cow, moo, or that is in the water under the earth. Anywhere you want to go, don't make images of any of that stuff. I don't want any of it. It's all bad. Don't want any of it. Verse 23. Of Exodus 20, you shall not make for yourselves gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. He really went on about this for some time. And then Moses came back down and he read these words to them, God's directions, and they said this, Exodus 24:7. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. That's just 8 chapters ago. The covenant was ratified with blood, Exodus 24:8, and Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. And then the elders went up on the mountain with him, Nadab and Abihu and Aaron and the 70 elders, and they saw the God of Israel. That close covenant relationship, and they turned aside quickly from all of that. And you know, the vehemence with which the Lord speaks here, how upset he is that his children, and he pictures it. I was just listening in Ezekiel today. He describes the people's unbelief, and that's way later, way later, 700 years later. He describes the people's unbelief and how it affects him, how he views it as though it is his beautiful bride, and she's going out whoring after other gods and setting up beds everywhere. And she's such a lousy whore that she doesn't even accept payment. She pays them. You know, that level of hurt, if you can imagine the hurt you would feel, and that is felt when a spouse is unfaithful. That's the kind of pain that this causes God. And just as in that situation, the offended spouse, the innocent party, is allowed to say, nope, done, gone. You ask for forgiveness, I'll forgive you, but I ain't got to take you back, right? Well, God was going to effectively divorce Israel here. You want those as your gods? You go ahead. I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. And that verb, that term, stiff-necked, sometimes for some reason in the ESV, sometimes it's the same thing as translated as stubborn. And it's the same picture, right? Stiff-necked, stubborn. They're the same thing. I think it would be better if they translated it consistently as stiff-necked. But that is something that God sees in his nation of Israel, in his son Israel, going on throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament. That term is still used. Now, therefore, let me alone that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them in order that I may make a great nation of you. Let's deal first of all with the wrath. The wrath of God is something that I was going to say I hope to never see, but I guess I will see, because on the last day, on that great and terrible day, that's the scripture's words, not mine, on that great for us, awesome, amazing, inconceivable, wonderful day is also a terrible day, because what is blessing to the saints is terror and judgment for unbelievers. In Revelation 8, the angel is offering up incense with the prayers of the saints, and then with the same fire, he throws down judgment on the earth. What is glad reception by God of us as his children, as the redeemed, as the faithful, is destruction to those who reject him. And that's important. They reject him, just like the children of Israel here. They rejected him. You know, Jesus says, before, as he is leaving Jerusalem the last time before his crucifixion, when he's done with his preaching to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the rebellious nation of Israel, he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who stone the prophets and kill those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your chicks together as a hen, gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not." Their unbelief is their own fault. If you're saved, you were saved by God's grace, and if you are damned, it is your own fault, because he comes with overwhelming grace and mercy, just as we're going to see play out here in this chapter, even though his wrath is burning hot and he intends. And understand this, God isn't spitballing here. He's not just venting and letting out his anger and blowing off steam. That's the concept I'm looking for. God is not blowing off steam. This is what he intends to do, that I may consume them. God doesn't play around. And he could do that and still keep his covenant, because his covenant was to make a great nation out of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And whose descendant was Moses? Yeah, he was the descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That I may make a great nation out of you. He could judge the rest of them and still be faithful to his covenant, and still be just. He's not parsing legalities here and finding technicalities where he can slam them and, blast them with fire from heaven and get away with it. No, he's completely just in what he would have done. And it is what he was going to do. We get some really interesting stuff here. And it parallels what we saw with Abraham when God and the two angels, God in human form, appeared to Abraham, and he was going down to Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy it, and Abraham pleads with him. Okay, we're going to see something similar here. And in that, if you go back and read in, drawing a blank on where it is in Genesis. If you go back and read that, you'll see that God's grace wins out. God's grace wins out. And it's not like God is two different things, like he's nice and he's angry, or one God, but thankfully, his grace is greater than his judgment. The judgment will come to pass, and that his grace is greater than his judgment is shown in this. Jesus. When you look at Jesus on the cross, you see God's grace and you see God's judgment. The judgment that all deserve, that you deserve, that I deserve, that judgment is poured out on Christ. God's still just, but his mercy and his love and his grace found a way to save us, even though we don't deserve saving. And we're going to see that grace being vocalized by Moses. Interestingly, Moses is thought of as the giver of the law because it's through him that God gave the law. But here we see Moses, and it is all grace, and that grace pleading with God. And as you think of that, as we go through this, I'll set this up. Think divine counsel. What does God want? He wants us to be in counsel with him. He wants us to interact with him. He wants us involved. That's what was going to go on. It's what did go on in the garden. It's what's going to go on in eternity. It's what God has with his heavenly counsel, the divine counsel, the B'nai Elohim. And there are different scenes in the scripture where they have conversation and where they hold court and where he listens to them and acts on. He goes, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. Okay. We see an earthly version of that with Moses, who went up on the mountain with God, who was there in God's presence, who at this moment is there in God's presence, and he is going to plead with God. But Moses implored the Lord, his God, and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster upon your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. Okay, so Moses implored. He really begs and pleads with the Lord. In another place, when he's pleading on behalf of Israel, he says, blot me out and save them. Right? That's pure grace. It's very Christ-like. I'll take their punishment. But make no mistake about it, this is really a discussion. God had decided he was going to do one thing, and rightly so, and Moses persuades him, his servant, the one who is known as the friend of God, right? Two of the coolest titles. Moses is known as the friend of God, and David is a man after God's own heart. Both imperfect, obviously so, in many ways, but they were special to the Lord, and the Lord listened to him. Think of all the places in the Psalms, go through the Psalms of David, and how he pleads with the Lord, how he talks with the Lord, and the Lord answers him. Well, we have that going on here. God had decided one thing, Moses persuades him to do the other. And to what does he mainly appeal to them? Number one, he says this. This goes back to Exodus 5, verse 3, where, and this was I believe it was Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh. Then the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence and the sword. So Moses is making an argument, and he's saying that if you wipe Israel out, it's going to appear that you fell on us with pestilence and the sword anyway. And that was part of the basis for which we pleaded and argued to be released from Egypt. So he goes to that. But then what else does he do? He talks about Abraham, Isaac, and he calls Jacob Israel, rightly so. But Israel, I didn't even think of this before. Who was Jacob? Jacob was Israel. Israel, his name was changed to Israel. This is the nation that came from Israel, the 12 tribes, all of that stuff. Moses is appealing to all of that and the kind and tender heart that God had toward Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob slash Israel. And as Moses is pleading these things, God's heart is softening. Now, that doesn't mean that God was wrong in what he was going to do. Whatever God did here would have been right. It would have been right. But he chose, as is his pattern going forward with the nation of Israel, even when it splits into two nations, the northern and the southern kingdom, Judah and Israel, even when that happens, his grace is bigger than his judgment. The gospel, the good news, God's grace, chesed, undeserved kindness and mercy is bigger than the law, than the righteous decree of the law. But because God is who he is, he can fulfill both. And it can only be fulfilled through Christ. There's something else at play here. There's something else at play here. When we see all of this stuff, when we see God's righteous anger and wrath at the children of Israel, and yet that he relents from his anger and forgives them, there's some judgment stuff still to go on, but big picture, he keeps them. He doesn't disown them. He keeps them as his own nation. And this is just this is the big foundation for all of the sin that Israel is going to do going forward. They're going to continue to do this stuff with the Asherahs, with Baal, with on and on and on, Molech, and on and on and on, and sacrificing their children in the fire and all this other stuff. But God is faithful. God is faithful. I'm not. I blow it. And this has to come home to us, right? I blow it. I rebel. I, in my heart, want a God that I can control and have do the things I want him to do, and a God who doesn't force me to do, lead me to do, call me to do the things that I don't want to do. So, big picture, we've talked about it before. When you see God's long-suffering patience with Israel, always put yourself right in the picture, because it's what applies to us. It is his long-suffering patience that brought us the Savior. It is his long-suffering patience that puts up with, and we can ask, and we do, when we hear about, and when we hear about the horrible, evil, wicked stuff that goes on in this world, just stuff we don't even want to mention, right? The abuse and death of children, and just abortion alone, right? How does God put up with it? That's a legitimate question that we ask. And we don't know the half of it, because we don't see everything. We don't know everything. We don't know much. But what I know is bad enough. How does God put up with that? He puts up with it because his grace is bigger than his judgment, his condemnation. It it holds sway, and so he is patient. And the piper will be paid, and judgment will be meted out, and there is a lake of fire, right? But God desires all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. How can God put up with all this stuff? Because he's still got more souls to save. And if that doesn't motivate us to reach out with the good news, to share the good news, to proclaim the good news in the face of adversity, to proclaim the good news to people who act like they don't want to hear it, then I don't know what does. Okay? So perspective always needs to come into play. And the Lord, verse 14, the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. He relented. He let it back down, and he allowed that grace that Moses spoke of to come to the fore. And there's always so many ways of looking at all this stuff. Do you think God allowed this to play out in this discussion the way he did to teach Moses something about mercy, about forbearance, about his enduring faithfulness to us, his faithfulness to the faithless? And I think so. I think so. And then we've got this very interesting thing of what happens next. Because you can't separate this, Moses pleading with God, with what happens next. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and on the back they were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. It says elsewhere, God did it with his own finger. That big intro there is given for a reason, because of what Moses is going to do, but it's more than that. It's big picture of what was going on. Just the contrast of the simultaneous thing, what God was working there on the mountain, what he was bringing down to us, while the children of Israel were doing what they were doing. The contrast is huge. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, "There's a noise of war in the camp." Now that right there tells you what kind of party this was. This wasn't a dinner party. This wasn't, noise from them celebrating as they took their turns with the stick to bust the piñata. Joshua, who was a man of war, we'll see later, Joshua was a seriously tough dude. Joshua heard it and thought it was war. There is the noise of war in the camp. But he, Moses, said, it is not. And there's just this sound of sadness, because Moses could now hear it. He couldn't hear it when he was up on the mountain. God heard it. God saw it. God knew full well what they were doing. Moses didn't. Now he's hearing it. It is not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear. And as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw down the tablets from his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. So you just can't miss this. And I'm not saying that Moses was a hypocrite, because he wasn't. He was indignant, and horrible sinful behavior should make us indignant. It should bother us. We should not go lightly on it. Sin needs to be called sin. And what we're going to see here from Moses, unlike Aaron, because there's a huge contrast there, is leadership. Moses walked in and he did what he did. He was true to who he was. He was large and he was in charge. He stood up and he did the wrong thing. This Moses has grown. This isn't the Moses who said, "Oh God, please send someone else." Right? He stood up, and through all that challenge and adversity that he'd been through with Pharaoh and then the Exodus and all of that, Moses had learned how to be a true leader. And his anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Why do you think he did that? And I'm not going to say I've got the answer. This is a thinking thing. I'm just thinking. I'm just wondering. I'm trying to get in Moses' head, put myself in that situation. Do you think maybe part of it was these people don't deserve this? This is this work of God that's in my hand, this covenant of grace and mercy, this awesome thing that no nation has ever had with their God, with the God, the one and only, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. They don't deserve this. They don't deserve this. I'm tossing those aside. Was it extreme that he threw them down and broke them? Yeah. But he throws them down and breaks them. Then what does he do? And don't you just envision him a la John Wayne? He's marching in here and he's just taking charge. I mean, there was a huge crowd of people, the whole nation. And he just comes in and shuts them down. Just one guy. Just one guy. No arms involved. No. People respond to leadership. and Moses was acting as the representative of God. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people drink it. It would make them sick. It would make them sick. And maybe it was a judgment thing there involved as well. We won't go into that. And Moses said to Aaron, "What did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" Look at the logic there. You brought this sin upon them. What did they do to you? What did they do to deserve this, that you did this? Kind of a different way of looking at it, isn't it? Who was in charge? Aaron was in charge. So might we say that the only way this should have been going on is if Aaron was dead? They wanted their drunken beer orgy and a golden calf, and Aaron stood up to him and they killed him. You know, why aren't you dead? Legitimate query. That's not what he says, but you should have resisted to the end is implied with this. What did they do? How bad were they that you brought this horrible sin upon them? Interesting take. And Aaron said, "Let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has come of him." Now, all of that so far is true. So I said to them, "Let any of you have gold, take it off." So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. I don't know if we were to go through and get, all of us work together and go take different parts of the Bible and go through and read and study and try to find the stupidest things that anyone ever said in the Bible. I think this has to be way up there. Just patently absurd statement. I threw this stuff into the fire and out came this calf. That's about as ridiculous as it gets. And again, that theme of leadership, and anybody, and only one of us here, at least in our group here on Zoom that I know, has been in the military. But I'm sure that he would tell us What do you do when you're responsible, when you're in charge, when you're in command? You own up to mistakes and failings, right? Yeah, I came up short. I blew it. I was supposed to maintain control, and I didn't. I failed. That's part of leadership too. You're not always going to succeed as a leader, but when you fail, you own up to it. Aaron is just failing in every possible way when it comes to leadership. He's doing something that a leader should never do. He's making excuses. He's making excuses. And it's real easy for me to find myself in that verse because I make excuses all the time. Half the time, when I am repenting to God because of my sin, or repenting to someone in my life because of my sin, what do? I make excuses. I make excuses. And when I make an excuse, in counseling, I tell people, and it's really hard, and to my dear wife, probably ironic to hear it coming out of my mouth, but I will tell people, when you're saying you're sorry, you say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have ever done that. I know it hurt you. And then you shut up. And then you just listen. Because after that, they'll tell you how hurt they really are. And you just have to keep your mouth shut and listen, because that's part of the process, right? Just owning up is really hard. It's really hard. It takes courage. It takes courage to just own up. I blew it. It takes courage to own up to the people in our lives when we've hurt them, when we failed them. And it certainly takes courage when and integrity. All those things go together, right? When we just confess our sin. And when Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies. I mean, that's really loaded. They broke loose. They just went nuts. No inhibitions. No inhibitions. And the worship of all these other gods, it was all wrapped up with perversion. Real perversion, right? For Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies. What does that mean? Everything that they were supposed to be, they were different. They were set apart. They were God's chosen ones. They were holy to the Lord, right? That's what was going to be on Aaron's turban. The gold plaque hung there above his forehead, holy to the Lord, because he represented Israel, set apart. That doesn't mean you're perfect. It means you're set apart for him. And instead, they're indulging in pagan revelry and perversion, worshiping a false god. It doesn't get much worse than this. It doesn't get any worse than this. But the only thing that would make it worse is if we were told that they were burning their children in the fire to Molech. Although even Baal worship, the statues of Baal, he's sitting on a throne and his hands are like this. And they would heat up his hands and lay their children in them. That's sick and perverted. That's sick and twisted. They hadn't gone that far, thankfully, but hey, they'd just gotten started. It was the frat party and it was only 12:30. There's still a whole lot of time to go. Who knows where it would have gone. Then Moses stood, and Moses, again, this is huge. The moral failing here, the rebellion against God, rebellion. Think of mutiny, barbarity. They always get it wrong on TV. If officers take over a ship from the captain, it's called barbarity, not mutiny. Mutiny is when enlisted men do it. This is both. Just total rebellion against God, and it calls for swift action. So the one who just pleaded for mercy, as far as them as God's people, is still going to be the agent of justice on them. Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me. I'll come back to that. And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. And he said to them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp. And each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor. And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses. And that day about 3,000 men of the people fell. Do you think that made a point? And Moses said, today you, the Levites, have been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one of you at the cost of his son and his brother, so that he might bestow a blessing upon you this day. So we've got the one thing here, that it is just justice. They were all guilty. Wasn't going to wipe them all out. What is it he says? It was about 3,000 that they killed. And the Levites, Moses was a Levite, his tribe came, the men came, and they meted out justice. And when we hear that, we think, wow, they took their swords and they went through the camp and they killed people. That's pretty severe. Think about where we were half a chapter ago. They got off easy. There were millions of them there. Only 3,000 died. Yeah, it made a statement. It made a statement. And the statement is this: crossing God is a really bad thing. Rebelling against him. It's one thing to fail him. It's one thing to come up short. Rebellion involves turning and going against him. And that's what they did. And that carries a terrible price. And you got off easy. You got off easy. We in our modern day go soft on judgment. We think that God is harsh and severe in different things, and he's not. He's not. We get off easy in comparison to what we deserve. All the world here, it gets off easy until the end. Justice will come. Complete and total justice will come. But what happens here is an extreme. It's not extreme. Where do you think things would have gone? Let's just go here. Where do you think things would have gone if Moses hadn't done this? You know, if I find out, and I won't say I, if a father finds out that his boys got kind of worked up on the weekend, and his high school boys went out and got invited. I won't even come up with anything specific I could, but some horrible, debaucherous, criminal activity. If he just said, boys, that was pretty bad. I'm going to have to ground you for 2 months, and I'm going to take your car keys. No. If you hear some horrible sound that sounds like the hounds of hell in the background, it wasn't arranged, but a fire truck is going by, and it's singing the song of Yukon's people, or German Shepherd, and he has to join in. So that's what that is. It's coming through my very effective microphone. Anyway, on that note of the hounds of hell, there are times when judgment, punishment, that's what this is. This is punishment, has to be very, very severe. Elsewise, it's going to continue. And don't think that strict punishment isn't a deterrent to crime, to sin. It is. It is. This served a purpose. This is a big deal. It's going to come again, the rebellion of Korah. And we'll just go through that because it's not here in the book of Exodus. In Korah's rebellion, the clan of Korah went against Moses and basically wanted to take over. And what did God do? He had the ground open up and swallow them all up, all of them. right? Because when they rebelled against Moses, they were rebelling against God. Here they had rebelled against God, and the judgment and the punishment was severe. As a result of this, the Levites are designated as jeans makers. They make jeans. No, Levi. The Levites were designated as the ones who were going to be the servants of the Lord. They would be the ones who did all of the peripheral stuff involving the tabernacle and the worship there. There weren't enough priests to do everything, and they took care of all of the externals and setting up the tabernacle and moving the tabernacle and doing all that stuff. And the priests would come from the Levites, etc. That's where this comes from. The next day, Moses said to the people, "You have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." So Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive the sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." Moses is playing the role of being Christ-like here. If saving them means I pay the price, that's okay. That's very Christ-like. And here we could talk a long time about this, but we're out of time. Your book that you have written. Again and again, the scriptures talk about the books. The books were opened up, and judgment at the end, the books are opened up. And what we've done is there. The greatest thing is having your name written in the book of life, right? That we are God's redeemed. But Moses references that in saying, "Blot me out of the book that you have written." But the Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." So those who had sinned, who didn't repent, who weren't going to repent, their judgment is their own. Their judgment is their own. But now go and lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you. And man, we're out of time because this gets so good. "Behold, my angel shall go before you." My angel. "Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them." Then the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf, the one that Aaron made. All kinds of stuff to talk about here, but we'll just hit it real quick. My angel. My angel. That angel is the one who, Exodus 14:19, "Then the angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them." God sends his angel. It is in ancient Judaism, back before the 2nd century, so 100 AD and later, 2nd century AD, Israel knew that there were the two powers of God. It's like the two Yahwehs, because this angel would appear that was God. He's going to appear to Joshua as the commander of the Lord's hosts. He appears in Daniel. He appears here. He's the one who leads them. It is the pre-incarnate Christ, just to summarize. So think of that. Jesus is the one who led the children in the wilderness, and that's referred to. It's in Jude, I think, or Peter, 2 Peter, is referred to directly, that he led them. Very, very, very interesting stuff. But just to tie a bow on that, the reason that they got away from understanding the two powers, and you can go back and people have done it. There are scholarly books and works and papers written on the rabbis of the Second Temple period. That's what we're in around the time of Jesus, from the time of the rebuilding of the temple. There was a very small temple on through the time of Jesus. That's called the Second Temple period. And the rabbis wrote about and talked about the two powers, it was after Jesus came that they had to do away with all that stuff, because Jesus came and said, I'm the Son of Man. That guy riding on the clouds in Daniel, mocking Baal, the cloud rider, I'm him. That's me. That's what flipped him out. And then they just eradicated that teaching altogether and said it couldn't be talked about anymore. Interesting from a stubborn and a stiff-necked people, right? The details of the plague, we'll deal with that another day, because it's not really talked about here. All right, we're going to close there. I want to thank you for listening. I want to encourage you, give us a thumbs up. It really does make a difference. I also invite you to subscribe. And if you subscribe, then make sure and hit the notification bell so that you are made aware when we put out new content. Please share this video with others. Share it on your social media platform. Send it to anyone you think might benefit from this teaching. And finally, come and pay us a visit. This is our website, decodingthedeception.com. If you know our name, you know the website. We've got all our Bible teaching videos out here, as well as a host of other resources to help you be informed so that you can decode the deception. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception. God bless and have a great day.